Czarna skrzynka samolotu, który się rozwalił.
The black box of the crashed plane.
Ja to nasz.
Shit, that's our plane.
No to moja robota.
Kiedy w Smoleńsku
While these dramatic events unfolded in Smolensk, the employees of the operational center of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs were trying to gain any information on what had actually happened in Russia.
w Rosji.
Tak, słucham.
Yes, please. Good morning, Ambassador. It's the Foreign Ministry Operational Center. Do we know anything more at this moment? I'm standing here right now. The plane is completely destroyed. We're standing 150 meters away, and there's no sign of life. They've put the fire out that covered the parts in the front, and that's it. The firefighters have surrounded the place.
To jest wszystko. Otoczone to jest już przez straż pożarną.
Is it certain that this is the plane? There's no doubt that it's the plane. Of course it is. Have you talked to the minister, sir? I haven't yet. Wait a minute, please. I will try to put you through. No, it's not working. Try to connect it, please. I'm going to sum it up to check if I will be able to repeat it. You gentlemen are 150 meters away from the plane. The fires have been put out. There's no sign of life. The plane is completely destroyed. Are you certain? Could you see the plane crashing? We only heard it flying low above the airport. Then we saw cars moving in that direction. Excuse me, sir, the minister is calling. All right. Operational center here. Sikorski. Yes, minister, sir. Any new information? I'm putting you through to my colleague. He's on the phone with the ambassador. The ambassador is on the other line. Should I forward the call? Of course. Then we connect and I'll call you in a few moments. Hello? Operational Center. I have the passengers list who were on the plane, Minister. How should I deliver it to you? Via email. Could you tell me who else was on the plane? Kaczynski. The President's wife, of course. Kaczorowski, Richard. The passengers list is very long, so reading out all the names, it's hard to pick the important ones. There's 89 names. Of course. Send it to my email, please. We have some problems at the ministry right now, though. We have no power and the repair works are in progress. But the emails are not working. It's the effect of the bad weather. Fax? The fax is working, so I can send it to the given number. Fine. Just give me a moment. I will call you back when I switch the fax on. Excuse me, I wanted to ask if you have talked to the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister and the Speaker of the Sejm already know. I personally spoke with Jarosław Kaczynski.
Awarie serwerów pocztowych nie były jedynymi awariami tego dnia.
That day there were more problems than just with the email servers. For a few days this building struggled with a power surge that cut the power of not only the email network but also the lifts.
Była również na przykład windy. W tych samych dniach od 9 do 15
On the same days, from the 9th to the 15th of April, at the military part of Okęcie Airport, the entrance control system was out of service. The system didn't collect information on people entering and leaving the airport.
A kto wychodzi z lotniska Okęcie? Tu cytat. Nie były rejestrowane wejścia i wyjścia.
There was no register of who entered and left through the gates with electronic readers. No log of used passes was recorded in the system.
Użytych przepustek.
The mysterious system outages were hardly the only puzzles of these days.
Zagadkami tych dni.
Вперед!
Нихуя себе!
Отец, полицию! Понял?
Нихуя себе!
Do Smoleńska prezydent
Lech Kaczynski, flying to Smolensk, took off from the military part of Okęcia airport. Some archive photos captured that moment, and they were later revealed by the military counterintelligence service.
Służbę kontrwywiadu wojskowego.
That day, on Polish TV channels, special programs about the 70th anniversary of the Katyn massacre were being broadcast. Poland lived on the different ceremonies that were supposed to start before midday. However, plans were disrupted by the news, which were unbelievable at first.
Na początku trudno było uwierzyć.
Dostałem przed chwilą informację, złą informację, jeśli tak mogę powiedzieć, ze Smoleńska. Prezydencki samolot...
I've just been informed about some news, some bad news, if I may say so, from Smolensk. The president's plane crashed there, according to the foreign ministry. In a second, we will try to speak with our reporter, Wojciech Cegielski, who was on the plane. We have no information on how serious the landing or even the crash was. We cannot say much more about it right now. The president was supposed to arrive at the Katyn cemetery at 9:20 with his wife and a representative of the Russian Federation. The details of this subject are currently very tense. It's hard to say what exactly happened there.
Szczegóły tej sprawy są bardzo lakoniczne. Trudno powiedzieć w tej chwili dokładnie, co tam się stało.
There's no clear information. At this moment, two rumours have reached the cemetery. According to the first one, the plane had caught a couple of trees during the landing, but it landed safely and no one was hurt. According to the second, unconfirmed one, which I've heard, some witnesses said the plane had looked like a ball of fire. Is the information true? How credible are they? I'm not able to evaluate right now.
Czy to są prawdziwe informacje? Jak bardzo wiarygodne? Trudno mi w tej chwili cokolwiek powiedzieć i ocenić.
Tak brzmią zapisy rozmów telefonicznych.
These are the recordings of the phone calls of the operational centre of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs from the morning of the 10th of April 2010. The operational centre of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, how can I help? Hello, Sikorski. Good afternoon, Minister. What do we know about the accident in Smolensk? Nothing at this time, sir. Then contact them, please. It is my understanding that the President's plane has broken down. I would like some information, please. I will call you right back. Thank you. Thank you. Hello, good afternoon, Minister, the operational centre here. I've just talked with the head of the consulate office and the attaché in Smolensk. They said the control tower passed along 15 minutes ago, that the plane caught on the trees during the landing and fell down. Good God. They know nothing else. It's crazy out there.
Ale jest wypadek, co jest rzecz potwierdzona, niestety.
But they confirmed there had been an accident. They said the control tower had passed such information.
Ministra Klicha, proszę.
I have already informed Minister Klich about that. If you could connect me with the Prime Minister and the Speaker of the Sejm, I have to talk to them. Please put me through. Please connect me using your channels. All right, we will try to call the Prime Minister. Thank you. I wanted to ask if you've talked to the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister and the Speaker of the Sejm were informed. I personally spoke with Jarosław Kaczynski. Understood. Thank you for the information. Thank you.
Pierwsze informacje.
The first source of information about the alleged course of the events were Russians. The Russians stationed at the airport traffic control tower in Smolensk passed the information to the Polish diplomats that the crash had been caused by the plane catching on trees, even though the place of the accident could not be seen from the control tower.
W Smoleńsku, choć z samej wieży nie widać było miejsca zdarzenia.
The decisions about the handling of the matter from the formal and legal perspective were also taken in Moscow and at the highest level.
I to z najwyższego szczebla.
Months later, Donald Tusk met with families of the victims of this tragedy in the Chancellery of the Prime Minister. Here's what the Polish Prime Minister said about how he had found out what happened on the 10th of April. I received a phone call from Minister Sikorski. It was Saturday. I was at home in 3 cities, and the minister called. I received information during a phone call, actually 3 phone calls on a short time, that there was a plane crash. No details, no information that any tragedy had occurred. According to the same source, the Prime Minister of the Russian Federation, Vladimir Putin, called Donald Tusk when he was on his way from Sopot to Warsaw. The first phone call from Prime Minister Putin took place in the car on the way to Warsaw. It was short and no statements of organisational or legal nature were expressed. Let's assume, by not relying on the goodwill too much, that everyone was in shock. Regardless of what ties people had with those who died, the situation and information was absolutely shocking to everyone. In the questions appeared a doubt concerning the effects of my first talk with President Medvedev, because the 2 calls occurred one after another. Both during the talk with Putin and with Medvedev, it was stated that we will carry out the investigation together.
Wypowiedź Donalda Tuska, że jego rozmowa telefoniczna...
The declaration of Donald Tusk that his phone call with Vladimir Putin and with Dmitry Medvedev was just a matter of courtesy and included no legal statements is controversial because between 9:30 and 11, Poland agreed to investigate the Smolensk plane crash under the Chicago Convention, or Attachment 13 to the International Convention on the Investigation of Civil Aviation Accidents, to be exact.
Cywilnych katastrof lotniczych. In
the email sent at 12:21 that day by the Ministry of Infrastructure, we read about the following course of the talk between the Russian and Minister of Transport and his Polish counterpart, the Minister of Infrastructure, Cezary Grabarczyk. During that talk, Minister Levitin extended his condolences and declared his readiness to help a potential Polish delegation of the committee that would arrive at Smolensk. The Ministry of Infrastructure summoned Edmund Klich, chairperson of the State Commission on Aircraft Accidents Investigation, in order to discuss the matter of the plane crash and the potential involvement of the Commission in the investigation of its causes.
Edmund Klich,
a retired colonel and then chairman of the State Commission on Aircraft Accidents Investigation, describes that morning and his talk with Cezary Grabarczyk as follows. I arrived from Dęblin by car. I instantly reported to Minister Grabarczyk. I presented the legal issue that appeared. I handed him Attachment 13 to the Convention on International Civil Aviation, the so-called Chicago Convention, and said that there was a legal problem because, at that time, at least to my knowledge, no definite arrangements between the Russian Federation and Poland had been set. The problem concerned the fact that the plane was part of the state aviation and was entered into the register of the national aircrafts. And Attachment 13 to the Convention does not cover the procedures of such aircrafts under the international law.
Państwowych statków powietrznych, a załącznik 13 do konwencji nie obejmuje procedowania tego typu statków. Zgodnie z prawem
Mr. Alexei Morozov called and informed me about the crash, asking about the procedures we should follow when investigating it. I told him, I don't know. He could ask, could it be Attachment 13? I repeated, I don't know. Attachment 13 defines strictly set rights and, in principle, the investigation should be carried out by the country the accident occurred in, while the registration country, the country using the plane, appoints only an accredited representative.
Państwo użytkownika wystawia tylko akredytowanego przedstawiciela.
One would think that choosing the legal basis for describing and investigating by Polish authorities such a crucial matter as a plane crash which the President of Poland and 95 other major public figures died in should be self-evident and clear. However, that was not the case. There is no document in existence that would describe and present in an obvious way how the Chicago Convention was chosen to be the legal basis for the investigation of the Smolensk plane crash.
Wyboru konwencji chicagowskiej jako sposobu badania katastrofy smoleńskiej.
Na przestrzeni lat w polskich instytucjach, w tym w Kancelarii Prezesa Rady Ministrów, powstawały dokumenty porządkujące informacje na temat spotkań.
Over the course of years at the Polish institutions, including the Chancellery of the Prime Minister, different documents were prepared that organised the information about the meetings and phone calls between Poland and Russia concerning April the 10th, 2010. What's interesting is the fact that only a minus sign appears in the table listing phone calls between Vladimir Putin, Donald Tusk and Dmitry Medvedev.
W wypadkach znajdują się szczegółowe sygnatury dotyczące dokumentów. Do notatek.
In other cases, we see details of different documents. No memos describing the phone calls between Donald Tusk, Vladimir Putin and Dmitry Medvedev could be found by any authorities that investigated the events of April the 10th, 2010. That day, at 1:40 p.m., a meeting of the government was called.
Tego dnia na godzinę 13:40 zwołane zostało posiedzenie rządu.
The Prime Minister gave a statement about the plane crash in Smolensk and the necessary actions that need to be taken in such a situation. Complementary statements were given by the Minister of Defense, Bogdan Klich, and Minister of Justice, Krzysztof Kwiatkowski. During that meeting, Prime Minister Tusk appointed an interdepartmental body of the government of the Republic of Poland, which was tasked with the coordination of actions concerning this matter. The Prime Minister appointed the interdepartmental coordination body of the matter of actions taken in connection with the tragic plane crash in Smolensk and declared readiness to help families of its victims. Yet exactly this body, led by Donald Tusk, officially agreed to the formula proposed by the Russians almost a week later, stating that the appropriate legal basis for the proceedings undertaken in order to establish the causes of the plane crash is the Chicago Convention and Attachment 13. His statement was only an official justification of the actions undertaken sooner, without making any decisions. Almost a year after the crash, Tomasz Arabski, the chief of the Chancellery of the Prime Minister Tusk, wrote about it in response to an interpellation. The agreement to follow these procedures was not expressed in written form, but through a mutual, consensual actions of the Polish and Russian parties. Thus, the parties agreed on the investigating proceedings of the Smolensk plane crash by undertaking joint actions in accordance with the aforementioned convention. The consequence of following the Chicago Convention was surrendering the entirety of control over the investigation to the Russians. The Polish government agreed to the proceedings chosen by Russia, although it had an agreement on the investigation of military aircraft accidents signed between Poland and Russia at its disposal. That agreement stated in Article 11 that the investigation of plane crashes shall be carried out jointly by appropriate Polish and Russian authorities. Donald Tusk did not make any statements about formal and legal matters crucial in the forthcoming course of events during the press briefing after the short meeting of the government. He only passed along condolences extended by the Prime Minister and President of Russia and informed that, together with the government ministers, he would be travelling to Smolensk. I would like to offer my sympathies to all Poles and the families of the victims on behalf of the whole world. Prime Minister Putin and President Medvedev were the first to call and extend their condolences. I am in constant contact with Russian ministers, officials and authorities. I am about to fly to Smolensk, where Polish prosecutors have already arrived. We do not exclude the possibility that today another meeting of the Council of Ministers will take place after the return. A moment later, Prime Minister Tusk flew to Russia. However, he did not land at Smolensk North Airport, but at Vitebska. He also opted against flying on any aircraft belonging to the 36th Regiment, choosing instead a civil lot plane. In Smolensk, Prime Minister Tusk met once again with Vladimir Putin. The first politician to make a proclamation to the Polish people that day was the President of Russia, Dmitry Medvedev. I promise that the circumstances of this tragedy shall be diligently investigated in close cooperation with Poland.
To właśnie w tym momencie Władimir Putin I inni najwyżsi przedstawiciele Rosji.
It is exactly at this moment when Vladimir Putin and other high-ranking representatives of the Russian government and intelligence service for the first time presented to the gathered members of Tusk's government the official but false Russian version of the course of events. According to that version, it was the Polish pilots that were accountable for the Russian actions that resulted in the death of 96 Polish citizens, including the President of the Republic of Poland. Donald Tusk adopted such a perspective as his own.
Przyjął jako własne.
To jest linia dziesiątki, trajektoria.
Here's the line of the 10th, the trajectory on the right. The runway is there, where you can see the lights.
A on poszedł tak. W lewo, trochę w bok.
It flew like that, a little bit on the left. It's almost 200 meters to the left of the runway. If it had continued on this path for 800 meters more, it would have hit the workshops building. We can't see the starting point. We're not allowed to go there.
To tam dalej są warsztaty. Uderzyłby w ten budynek. Początek to okej, nie zobaczymy. Nie możemy tam iść.
Wylot Donalda Tuska do Rosji nie przynosi jednak żadnych rezultatów.
Donald Tusk visiting Russia did not have any impact on the part that Poland played in the investigation of the causes and circumstances of what happened. In reality, Poland became just a spectator of the proceedings undertaken by the Russian party. The investigation was carried out by a committee under Vladimir Putin, but officially led by Tatiana Anodina. The prosecutor's investigation is also carried out by the Russian prosecutor's office. Polish authorities undertake their own actions approximately at the same time. They have to operate without access to direct evidence.
Które pozbawione są dostępu do bezpośrednich dowodów. O tym, że premier Tusk...
The fact that Prime Minister Tusk, during his time in Smolensk, did not offer Vladimir Putin and Russia a joint investigation was proved by the answers to questions asked by the family members and their proxies in the chancellery of the Prime Minister half a year later.
Spotkania w kancelarii prezesa Rady Ministrów pół roku później.
Nie wykorzystywaliśmy.
We did not use the agreement in the case of the Smolensk plane crash because of reasons I had tried to explain with better or worse results. The Chicago Convention, not the agreement, was chosen as the basis for the procedures because, in our evaluation, which I personally find accurate, from Poland's point of view, that agreement firstly, would be impossible to apply due to its sources, and secondly, even if we persisted on checking the effectiveness of the agreement, it would turn out to be even less favourable from the Polish perspective than the Chicago Convention. As a result, Poland lost its access to any direct evidence concerning this matter.
W tej sprawie.
Czy istniały jakieś narzędzia?
Would you say that there were some tools available at that time which could prevent such a situation occurring? To give Poland access to the evidence? Such tools, of course, were available, but they should have been used during the first few days. What I mean is that we should have done what other countries have done when there was a plane crash involving their citizens. You make a phone call informing that you arrive at the territory of another country. Then you come, secure and collect the evidence and leave. However, this type of action can only be undertaken in the first days. This opinion is not only the result of our observations. Edmund Klich said the same thing. Edmund Klich, at the end of April 2010, when he forced a meeting with the Prime Minister Tusk and members of his government, said the following about the Chicago Convention. The plane crashed on Saturday, 10th of April, at about 9 a.m. Polish time. Only on the 13th of April, so 4 days later, did Prime Minister Putin, or rather the chairperson of the Interstate Aviation Committee, make a statement about the decision to follow Attachment 13 in the proceedings. 4 full days. I thought during that time a discussion was held in order to choose the agreement instead. In my opinion, at that time, Russia was compliant enough to accept the agreement.
Jest taka, że można było wybrać
Porozumienie, które można było...
According to Klich, the agreement that could be chosen is the agreement of 1993 between Poland and Russia. It results from the same recording that almost 2 weeks after accepting the Russian proposal to apply the Chicago Convention, Donald Tusk was told by the Polish accredited representative that under the Chicago Convention, Poland cannot get involved in the investigation. It can only observe and serve the Russian Federation. Apparently, the Polish Prime Minister had a hard time understanding these conditions.
Federacji Rosyjskiej. Polski premier ma najwyraźniej problem nawet ze zrozumieniem tego stanu rzeczy.
How is it beneficial for the Polish investigation? Mr. Prime Minister, I am afraid there is a misunderstanding. I would like to discuss one more issue. Unfortunately, we didn't understand each other. We speak different languages. I cannot explain it any better, sir. It's not a private matter, Mr. Chairman. I am aware of that. I need to understand what you are saying to me. Well, I will try once again. Annex 13 provides clear procedures, and it is obvious that we are not responsible for the examination. The Russian side is responsible for it. We are only to ensure that things are transparent, that we participate in the examination and assist the Russians, making available relevant documents, and that this is what it's about. The Russian side is responsible for the final report. In the situation where we know with whom we are dealing, just look at Donald Tusk smiling as usual, who basically is not resourceful at any stage. He is a person for who, I'd say, a scrap in the form of a good word does not demand anything. And this is how he acted. It means that everybody is watching, the entire world is watching. And at that moment, he should have made a phone call to the head of NATO and said, "Our president is dead. We are a member of NATO. We cannot rule out any possibilities. We ask for your support. There is a military aircraft there. There are state secrets there. There are satellite telephones, generals, and the most important persons in the state are there. We are entering the site. Please help us to pack it and bring it to Poland. And then we will continue discussions." And the Russians expected this. In general, this was the common feeling. Not only among us, public prosecutors or Edmund Klich thought so, but also, as it transpires from the documents, that those first 3 days were decisive, and they would have made no protest. Besides, I went through such a thing during those first days at my interrogation. You know, when dealing with me, they are at times going very far. Unless I put my foot down, then they were kind of going back, which means that they were testing how far they could go. The issue of participation of member states of the European Union in the process of explaining the event was raised in Russia during the meeting of the Russian committee examining it under the leadership of Vladimir Putin. The Russian Prime Minister led the work of the committee. Polish ministers Ewa Kopacz and Tomasz Arabski participated in it together with Russian ministers, as well as Edmund Klich, accredited by the Russian committee, and public prosecutor Parulski. On the 13th of April 2010, a meeting of the committee of Ms. Anodina, that is, the MAK committee, was held, which, on order of Putin, was to examine the catastrophe. During that meeting, Ms. Anodina informed, among others, Mr. Parulski, but also Mr. Arabski and other representatives of Poland who were present there, that the representatives of NATO and of the European Union authorities volunteered to take part in the examination concerning that catastrophe. The investigative bodies of the European Union and other states expressed their desire to participate in the works of the technical committee, should such needs arise. However, they declared that they had no doubts as to the objectivity and professionalism of the Russian committee. The MAK experts have great experience in international investigations. Such investigations were conducted in 53 countries, and none of them have been challenged by means of litigation. None of the present members of the government or the representatives of the investigative bodies or of the institutions examining the plane crash reacted to those words of Tatiana Anodina.
Chcieli mieć gwarancję, że to strona polska odrzuciła współpracę z NATO i z Unią Europejską.
They wanted the guarantee that it was the Polish side who rejected the cooperation with NATO and the European Union in investigating this disaster. that it was the Polish side who guaranteed to the Russians the total dominance over their entire operation and enabled them to forge all the recordings, all the materials, to such an extent that it was worth remembering that when the so-called black boxes, that is, the sound and flight recorders, were examined for the first time, the Polish public prosecutors did not record it, did not take any photographs, did not draw up any document describing the course of that procedure. The Russians did, but the Polish Public Prosecutor's Office didn't even ask them to provide us with any document of it.
Rosjanie zrobili, ale nawet polska prokuratura się nie zwróciła o to, żeby Rosjanie przekazali nam jakikolwiek dokument.
And that procedure was particularly interesting because the Russians did not allow the Poles to listen to the black box recordings then.
Wówczas nie pozwolili Polakom wysłuchać tego, co jest zawarte w tych skrzynkach.
Taking over the total control of the proceedings, in this case by the Russians, with the consent of the Polish government, resulted in a situation where the Russians were the only party in the possession of the evidence, not only the original black boxes, but also the plane wreck. During the first year after the plane crash, the Russians, month or so, tell Minister Sikorski or other governmental officials that of course they were going to hand over the wreck immediately. Pursuant to the Chicago Convention, once the report had been published, one is obliged to deliver all the evidence to the state which is the owner of the aircraft that crashed.
Wszystkich materiałów dowodowych temu państwu, które jest właścicielem samolotu, który uległ katastrofie. I Rosjanie właśnie deklarują przez pierwszy rok, że tak, natychmiast wam oddamy.
For a year, the Russians declared that they would do so immediately. But after 2 years, then they say, certainly not, basing on the agreement which concluded in May 2010. Under this agreement, the Polish side, represented by the then Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs and the head of Aviation Accidents Investigation Committee, signed their consent that the black boxes, the flight recording devices, which are the most important pieces of evidence, will be released when Mr. Putin decides so.
Czarne skrzynki, czyli że najważniejszy dowód, jakim są rejestratory, będą oddane wtedy, kiedy zdecyduje o tym pan Putin.
MAK, jako organ prowadzący...
MAK, as the authority conducting the technical examination, secures the storage of the original flight recorder recordings, sealed by both parties in order to prevent any unilateral access to them. The original flight recorder recordings may be provided to Poland under a decision of a relevant authority of the Russian Federation after the investigation or court proceedings is completed. As we understand it, the Polish side is willing to sign a relevant memorandum setting out all the terms and conditions of such evidence handing over. According to the Chicago Convention and the annexes to it, including the obligation to keep secret all the conversations of the crew in the cockpit with the ground control and other persons. I have brought with me a copy of the contents of the so-called black boxes. I have the electronic recording. This version, of course, requires processing because it is so-called raw recording, containing a lot of noise, from which one must extract meaningful words. I was also provided with a copy held by the Russian committee, led by Ms. Tatiana Anodina, which copy may serve as comparative material for us and will most certainly be used.
Komisji nadzorowanej przez panią Tatianę Anodinę, która jest materiałem porównawczym dla nas. Na pewno będzie wykorzystany.
Signing the agreement which deprives Poland of access to evidence in this case is the result of confusing game of the Russian Federation to which Poland succumbs. 2 weeks earlier, the Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk talks on the phone with the Russian Prime Minister Vladimir Putin. During their conversation, they conclude that until the 1st of June, the parties should determine the rules according to which Poland would receive from Russia, quote, source materials. It is exactly under those rules, in return for the access to the source materials, that Poland agreed that Russia would decide how long it would keep the evidence in this case.
Będzie decydować o tym, jak długo przetrzymuje dowody w tej sprawie.
The most important rule is that until the 1st of June 2010, the Russian side will deliver to the Polish side the source materials from the proceedings, in particular the so-called black box recordings. Therefore, it will be possible to present such recordings to the general public in Poland and Russia before the completion of the work of the committee. In reality, those source materials turned out to be copies of the recordings, for which numerous requests had to be made to obtain them. And as a result of the agreement signed by Putin and Tusk, Poland gave up the rest of the rights which were guaranteed to it under the Chicago Convention, it being disadvantageous for Poland as it were. The agreement, which was imposed on Tusk by Putin and then signed by Miller and Anodina in the presence of the General of the KGB and FCB, Sergei Ivanov, resulted in irrevocable loss of access by Polish institutions to the key direct evidence concerning Smolensk. It de facto guaranteed impunity to Russia.
De facto zagwarantowało Rosji bezkarność.
The Russians started at full throttle, meaning that all of them came to the site. Scrap metal salvagers to cut the wreck, physicians, public prosecutors, psychologists, officers, while Donald Tusk packed a plane with all his ministers and flew there, all of them in the same aircraft.
I poleciał tam na miejsce wszyscy jednym tym samym samolotem.
In every criminal proceeding concerning fatalities, the bodies of the victims constitute evidence. How the Russians dealt with this issue. Małgorzata Wasserman saw it in Moscow with her own eyes.
Widziała to w Moskwie bezpośrednio.
I remember the morgue, and I remember this image, this impact of the Russian state advancing like a bulldozer, and the hysterical helplessness of Polish officials. So, as I'm saying, it was like a conveyor belt, a public prosecutor, an interpreter, an expert, family, interrogation, procedures, we go on. And here are just a couple of doctors on the Polish side, to whom I have no objections at all, because they were staggering with fatigue, having to examine so many bodies. I do not know how many of them there were exactly. I will never learn. But there were just a few. I suspect that they had no sleep for 48 hours. As I'm saying, there were no official support on the Polish side, just those few tired doctors somewhere there, because I did not see. Miss Eva Kopacz was eager to offer coffee and backslapping, but she forgot what she had come there for. She was not supposed to act there as a psychologist and psychiatrist. She came there as a highest-ranked government official to deal with medical procedures.
Przyjechała jako najwyższy rangą urzędnik państwowy do załatwiania procedur medycznych.
During the meeting organised by Vladimir Putin's committee in Moscow, Eva Kopacz also gave a speech. Here is her speech on April the 13th, 2010. In the beginning, I would like very warmly and kindly, sincerely, with all my heart, thank my counterpart, the Russian Minister of Health. We are working like one family. Honestly, it is the first time that I am a witness of such good cooperation and complementing each other's work. I have been also authorized by the victims' relatives, who have also been here and already left home, to thank Mrs. Minister for her commitment and hard work. I also have a request from those who have returned home without the possibility to identify their relatives. We are asking you for more, namely very hard work of geneticists. We would also like very much, when presenting a report to the Polish people, to be able to say with clear conscience, we have done everything. We have managed to identify all the bodies. Once more, I thank you very much.
Jeszcze raz gorąco dziękuję.
To have full evidence, an autopsy, is one of the most important pieces of that evidence. However, we were in such a dramatic position that besides the bodies, we had nothing at all. In connection with the above, if I were the leading public prosecutor, then I would absolutely cling to that only piece of evidence. 2 months after the catastrophe, my confidence in the Russian evidence dropped down to zero, and not only mine, but all the people who were dealing with them.
A nawet gdyby ktoś był bardzo, bym powiedziała, naiwny, tak jak...
And even if someone is very naive as the government of Donald Tusk and Ewa Kopacz, there still existed the legal obligation under the Code of Criminal Procedure, which stipulates the duty to examine the evidence independently. I asked the doctor who performed a surgery on my father, unfortunately already late Professor Herman, and he came with me to Warsaw. There he was shown this document and provided his opinion on it. He read it out to them point by point. I'm not going to go into details like the colour of the eyes, height, gender and so on, but he remembered he also had medical documentation. I provided it earlier to the public prosecutor's office as well, so I acted fully professionally. So there was no pancreas, only a stub is left. This is not what is stated. Here it is described in centimetres. How many and what? So it was obvious that we were dealing with a document which provides untrue information and, consequently, does not state the true cause of death, thus hampering the proceeding. Every reasonable public prosecutor with average experience would know that the exhumation and post-mortem must be done at once. I had, as I'm saying, to go as far as saying during a live television interview that I would reveal classified documents if the public prosecutor's office continued to ignore me. So, what if they would put allegations against me? I would be putting myself at risk, but maybe I would end this lie. I left the TV studio after the programme and answered my phone, which was ringing. They were inviting me to the public prosecutor's office. Just imagine how I had to strive to get the first post-mortem of a crash victim in Poland be made. In August 1980, the Gdansk shipyard was situated in this place. 150 metres beside me, there is Division W4, where Lech Wałęsa, formerly a secret collaborator of the secret police with the pseudonym Bolek, worked. At that time, Gdansk shipyard also employed Anna Walentynovich, called Ania Solidarność. In her defence, the workers from that facility rebelled against the government. As a result, they removed the first brick from the wall supporting the Empire of Evil. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics disintegrated several years later. In the Gdansk shipyard, Ania Walentynovich worked on the cranes where ships were built. Today, different cranes operate in the former shipyard area. They build apartment blocks in the place where no one makes ships anymore. One of the such lists is operated by Janusz Walentynovich, the son of Ania. This is the Smolensk story told by Janusz Walentynovich.
Historia smoleńska, opowiedziana przez Janusza Walentynowicza.
Zarówno pani Kopacz, jak i pan Arabski mówili nam, że jeżeli już się zdecydowaliśmy tu przylecieć...
Both Mrs. Kopacz and Mr. Arabski were telling us that if we decided to come here, we should try hard to identify the bodies, because the coffins would not be opened in Poland, that it would not be possible to make any corrections, changes or something due to sanitary reasons. At least this is what we were told.
Ja ją rozpoznałem w 100% od razu po twarzy, później prosiłem, żeby...
Finally, they found my mum. I recognized her at once by her face. Then I asked them to uncover her entire body and to prove that it was my mum. I stated where she had surgery scars, where they should be, and pointed to those places. When they recorded it all, I identified my mother. They took her body away.
To ciało mamy zabrali. To był rok 2010.
It was 2010. In July, if I remember correctly, of 2012, the medical documentation from Moscow arrived, and the military prosecutor's office informed me that if I wished so, I could get acquainted with that documentation. So, I went with my son to the military prosecutor's office, and surprisingly, in the medical description of allegedly my mum's body, or in other words, of a body buried in our grave, there were described internal organs which my mum did not have.
Mojej mamy, czyli inaczej, ciała pochowanego w naszym grobie. W tym opisie medycznym są opisane narządy wewnętrzne, których mama nie miała.
So I said that this documentation did not concern my mother, and that we demanded the immediate exhumation of the body and establishing who it was and where my mother's body was.
W momencie, kiedy otwarto grób, wyjęto.
When they opened the grave and took out the body of the person who was buried in our family grave, a post-mortem revealed that it was Ms. Teresa Walewska-Pszelkowska. So in theory, my mother should have been buried in the grave of Ms. Teresa Walewska-Pszelkowska. But during the post-mortem of that body, it turned out that it was deprived of the head. So the question arises, if this is Ania Valentinowicz, then whom did I identify in Moscow? I do not know until today who is buried in our grave.
W naszym grobie.
According to the documentation sent to Poland, the person who was buried as Ania Valentinowicz had light brown hair, and traces of methamphetamine were found in her body.
Znaleziono ślady metamfetaminy.
I cannot explain it. I simply can't. I have already come to terms with the thought that I will never find the body of my mother and that I will not meet the obligation, keep the promise which I gave to her. Because I promised her that after her death she would be buried beside my father, as she was very concerned about that. I promised that it would be so. Now I know that I will not keep that promise. I have accepted the fact that I will never find her body. But I would like at least to make the grave in Srebrenicko Cemetery, a symbolic one, and that everybody would know it. I can't do anything more. I just can't.
Nic więcej nie mogę zrobić. Po prostu nie mogę.
Z ujawnionych materiałów KGB, jaczejki KGB-owskiej ulokowanej w konsulacie.
From the disclosed materials of the KGB's political unit located in the Soviet consulate in Gdansk on Batarego Street, it transpires that as early as during the August strike of 1980, the KGB radar, the Soviet radar, which was to monitor the situation during the strike, and various, we may say, liaisons in the Inter-Factory Strike Committee, was, among others, particularly focused on Ania Valentinowicz, due to the fact, which did not go unnoticed by the Soviets, that Ania Valentinowicz entered that room.
Ze względu na to, co odnotowali Sowieci, że Anna Walentynowicz przyszła do tej sali i poza wszystkim, o czym mówiła, co jest znane, więźniowie polityczni, obrona pierwszego.
Apart from all the other things she said, as we know about political prisoners, the defense of the first postulate, the emergence of a free trade union, which would be independent from the communists and which then took on the name Solidarity, Ania Valentinowicz demanded that the truth about the Katyn be told. We may say that this is a special reason why the KGB got interested specifically in her. I sometimes think about all the things told by Janusz here and what we know about that story related to the Smolensk tragedy, that there must be some kind of revenge in it. And this concern, as I've been thinking about all those stories which we heard here, has been with me for many years. When I think about Anna Valentinowicz, Smolensk, about this quasi-investigation and the search of the body of Anna Valentinowicz, which took a few years.
O tym pseudośledztwie, i o tym poszukiwaniu przez lata ciała Anny Walentynowicz.
Podobnych przypadków było dużo więcej. W czerwcu roku 2017
There were many more cases like that. In June 2017, the deputy of Chief Public Prosecutor, Marek Pasionek, informed the public about them. The military prosecutor's office conducted 9 exhumations, which revealed that 6 bodies had been replaced with different ones. In the grave of Natalia Januszko, the youngest victim, parts of the body of 5 other persons were found. The coffin of General Bronislaw Kwiatowski contains 14 fragments of the bodies of 7 different people. The coffin of Archbishop Miron Chodakowski contained half of his body. In the coffin of President Lech Kaczynski, fragments of the bodies of 2 other persons were found. Concerning Poland's aspirations to be a serious NATO member, indeed, such a treatment of our late president, well, if you forgive me, I will leave it without comment. Please draw your own conclusions.
Pamięci prezydenta to ja pozwolicie państwo już pozostawię bez komentarza. Wnioski proszę sobie samemu wyciągnąć.
Very soon, 41 Russian doctors will hear charges related to their counterfeiting the documentation and hampering the investigation. It will then translate to the persons who were involved in this proceeding in Poland. If we are dealing with over 40 individuals who forged documents in a case of such fundamental importance, and those individuals act on the instruction of the Russian Federation because it was not their private job, then we are facing. It is hard to assume that we are facing the situation where all of them did so driven by his or her own private reasons. It means that there existed some pattern of behavior.
Pierwsze, rodzi to uzasadnione podejrzenie, że w podobny sposób potraktowano cały...
First, it leads to a justified suspicion that all of the other evidence was dealt with in a similar way. Secondly, what you just said, that 41 persons do not act spontaneously, but rather according to some official message. But this was something that was not kept secret from us in Moscow. I mean, they told us. If something could not be done, then they told us that we should just approach Vladimir Putin about it. I think that they would not dare, in case of an event of such importance, to be careless by themselves. But they went even further. For instance, when I read or looked at those photographs where they'd sewn cigarette butts or other such things inside, I was aware that it was spitting into our face as Poland. This man did not spit in the face of Małgorzata Wasserman, whom he did not know. It was like them saying, "Here, Polacks, have your president or your general with a recovered shoe and a cigarette butt sewn into his leg." And Donald Tusk never stopped saying that those relations and that cooperation were above standard, and that he hoped that this would improve the relations between Poland and the Russian Federation. Many years later, in 2021, the film by Ewa Stankiewicz included a shocking footage of what the practice, the real activity of the Polish Minister of Health, who then became Prime Minister, looked like during the work concerning the identification of the bodies of victims of that tragedy. The smallest scrape which was examined, the smallest remnant which was found at the site of the catastrophe. At that time, when the ground at the crash site was dug very thoroughly, more than 1 metre deep, and sieved in a particularly careful manner, every found piece was tested genetically.
Każdy znaleziony skrawek został przebadany genetycznie.
Mniej więcej w tym czasie
More or less at the same time, not only the instances of desecration of the bodies of the crash victims come to light. Not only news about making phone calls from the mobile phone of President Kaczynski, but the theft and use of credit cards of one of the victims. When it turned out that the credit cards were stolen by another Russian unit than it was supposed to in the beginning, the spokesman of the Polish government, Paweł Grasz, from the office of Prime Minister, apologised in Russian to the members of the OMON, the anti-terrorist police unit of the Smolensk district, as follows.
OMON-u obwodu smoleńskiego.
I would like to apologise to the members of the OMON in the Smolensk district. It was just a mistake. I wish you all the best, happiness. Thank you for what you did during the tragedy at the Smolensk airport. In those first months, Warsaw receives coded messages, from which it arises that the Russians knew that the identification of those bodies would result quite simply in establishing that they were other people than those described in the documentation. As a consequence, different persons were buried in family graves than the relatives whom the families were convinced they buried there. Yes, it must be said that between May and September, really, of 2010, the Polish authorities, I mean here the Polish authorities in a very broad sense, including the Polish Prime Minister, Polish ministers, Polish public prosecutors, were informed by the Russians. First, about who was in the cockpit and what they were going to do with regard to the image and liability of General Błaszczyk. You mean the Russians? I mean the Russians, yes. And then, unfortunately, even those drastic events concerning the replacement of these bodies. The Russians tell all this in confidential conversations with the Polish side at different levels. Many diplomatic notes and notes from such conversations with the Russians on this subject have been made. The encrypted message of the 7th of May 2010 from Moscow to Radosław Sikorski and Tomasz Arabski concerning the meeting of Jerzy Miller with Tatiana Anadina containing her lie about the presence of General Błaszczyk in the cockpit reads as follows. Tatiana Anadina thanked for the participation of the Polish experts in the work of the technical committee, giving high praise to their professionalism. She asked for assistance in the identification of third persons who during the flight were in the cockpit, at the same time informing that it had been established on the basis of the flight recorder recordings that the door to the cockpit was opened. Apart from the flight crew, Air Force Commander General Błaszczyk was also present in the cockpit. The memo from the meeting of Prime Minister Tusk with the Special Envoy of Vladimir Putin, Igor Levyatin, held on the 15th of May 2010. The committee of Tatiana Anadina will publish a press release and give recommendations as a public document. Such recommendations will concern the organisation of the flight, flight crew qualifications, preparing the aircraft, the airport and the flight itself. It will be announced to the general public that the crew of the Jack 40 aircraft communicated with Tu-154 and that in the cockpit were persons who were not flight crew members. In this conversation of Tusk with Putin's envoy, for the first time the Russian make deceptive suggestion, which is then exploited for years, that the telephone conversation of Lech Kaczynski and Jarosław Kaczynski could have had a connection with the tragedy. After several years, the Public Prosecutor's Office unequivocally established that the time of making the call rules out any connection between the content of the conversation and the cause of the subject event. Igor Levyatin referred to the words of the Public Prosecutor Seramet concerning the telephone conversation of Jarosław Kaczynski with President Lech Kaczynski during the flight. He pointed out that the Russian side had provided the Polish side with the mobile of President Kaczynski. The lack of that piece of evidence obstructed the investigation. Igor Levyatin asked to amend the situation. The encrypted message of the 27th of September 2010 from Moscow to Radosław Sikorski concerning the conversation with the head of the International Cooperation Department of the Russian Public Prosecutor's Office reads as follows. Dissatisfaction of the Polish society with the work of the Russian authorities will most certainly increase when it learns that several several samples of the material taken for genetic tests are not compliant with the results of the victims' identification by their families. Andreyevich Lidvishko is afraid that all the blame for this will fall on the Russian investigators. He explained that under the pressure of time, the families of the victims, and the Polish authorities, it was permitted to put the bodies to coffins without waiting for the DNA test results, because some of the results came only after many weeks. In the entire sequence of the Polish-Russian contacts after the 10th of April 2010, the Russian investigators, politicians and diplomats provided information to the Polish side, meaning all the issues related to, between quotes, the drunk Błaszczyk in the cockpit, the issues related to, all those fake concerning, the telephone conversation between Jarosław Kaczynski and Lech Kaczynski, the replacement of the bodies. The Russians told him of how one could close the coffins in Moscow without taking DNA samples. All those things, which then exploded as great media scandals in Poland since May 2010, were provided bit by the Russians to the Polish side. In other words, when the Polish Prime Minister went skiing or for another vacation, and Anodina published her report, and then the Polish Prime Minister was perfectly aware of all those Russian time bombs. I'm speaking of the media bombs which thoroughly shook the Polish society after the publication of the report of Anodina. Despite the knowledge of the Polish Prime Minister about the real attitude of Russia as a state and its officials to Poland with regard to Smolensk, all direct relations between Prime Minister Tusk and Prime Minister Putin were characterized by full docility. It is clearly evident in the note from the telephone conversation between the Prime Ministers of Poland and of Russia, which was held on the 29th of April 2010. Prime Minister Donald Tusk expressed his appreciation of the work of the Russian team for the last 3 weeks. Donald Tusk mentioned that he had directed those words also to the President of the Russian Federation, Dmitry Medvedev, at the Wawel Castle on the 18th of April 2010. Donald Tusk pointed out that all the Polish representatives present in Moscow underlined the particular commitment of the Russian side in the work concerning the identification of the victims of the tragedy. He also mentioned that the general public in Poland highly evaluates the commitment of the Russians. Prime Minister Vladimir Putin expresses his dissatisfaction from the positive reactions of Polish people regarding the progress of the investigation. Donald Tusk emphasized that he was concerned that the cooperation between the committees be as good as possible, exchanging documents and transparency. Donald Tusk noted that until then the cooperation with the Russian side was overstandard and that for the sake of the effectiveness of further work it was important to maintain a good atmosphere. What is shocking for me, in almost every recorded conversation between Donald Tusk and Vladimir Putin, which we can have access to, is that he speaks of very good, above-standard Polish-Russian relations. My father gets killed, my president gets killed. 96 of the most prominent persons in Poland die in absolutely unbelievable circumstances. And during the first hours, minutes and weeks after the catastrophe, he says that he hopes that this experience will improve the Polish-Russian relations? This is absolutely shocking.
Jesteś blisko wszystkich naszych myśli, staje się realne to, co nam się przyśni i wszystkie słowa wypowiedziane jesteś naszym wrogiem albo naszym